So let's talk about Tuesday.
Donald Trump completed his political comeback. The 45th president will now become the 47th after building a coalition of working-class voters across all races and age groups.
Yeah, Jake, he swept all 7 of the toss-up states and made massive improvements in deep blue states like my home state of New York and Jake's home state of Illinois.
There are lots of people on both sides of the aisle trying to tell you what it means, but here's one thing that we learned for sure on Tuesday: our democracy works. Our electoral process, Luke, it still works.
And Donald Trump agrees. Here's what he had to say in the early morning hours after this election.
It is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy? But it's a political victory that our country has never seen before, nothing like this. I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president.
Trump is saying that now, even though he had a very different message in the early morning hours after the last election.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. We did win this election.
For the record, he did not win that election. Compare that speech by the loser of the 2020 race to these words from the loser of the 2024 race.
We must accept the results of this election. Earlier today, I spoke with President-elect Trump and congratulated him on his victory. I also told him that we will help him and his team with their transition, and that we will engage in a peaceful transfer of power.
And Jake, who would have thought that committing to a peaceful transfer of power would be a raucous applause line?
Yeah, not sure about that. Something we're not used to in this decade.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to hear from you. Why do you think that Donald Trump won on Tuesday night?
Yeah, I've mentioned this multiple times on Talking Points before. I actually did a segment on this about a year and a half ago, and I quoted Bill Clinton and said, "It's the economy, stupid." Now, a couple economic numbers to cite. We're adding 170,000 jobs a month. The GDP is booming. It's growing at 2.8%. Consumer spending is surging. Paychecks are growing at a 3% rate, but the important thing here, Luke, is Americans do not agree. Public opinion on the economy is down. Americans are still feeling inflation. They're still feeling that wages are not catching up, and I think that was a large part of this election. Now, there's so many things to dive into, and I know we're going to do that, but the economy was the number one issue. It always is the number one issue, and voters did not feel that it was working for them, and I think that was a huge part of this election.
Well, another common political slogan is promises made, promises kept. Joe Biden, when he came into office after the 2020 race, after the COVID pandemic, promised to bring the country back to normal, and then you saw a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that tanked his popularity numbers. He never recovered from that fact, Jake. He did not bring the country back to normal. It wasn't normal seeing him up on the debate stage back in June, completely decompensating, had to drop out a month later, seeing the shortest possible campaign ever, 107 days that we've seen from a presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. She did the best she could with what she had. A very unpopular administration, very unpopular record, despite the facts that you point out behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're doing a great job pointing out the optics, because I think a lot of politics in a lot of these elections is optics. It's how Americans feel. And one other thing I do want to point out about the economy is if you look at those swing counties that swung hard for Trump, that went for Biden, while they're all in the bottom 20% of the housing market. Americans are still feeling a tough housing market. Those counties all have a low rate of home ownership change. That means people are not buying homes. They're still feeling that this economy is not working for them, and that makes them feel that the Biden-Harris administration was not working for them. And then when you see Biden go up on the debate stage, struggle there, and there was haggling for almost a month after that before he dropped out, and Harris only had 100 days to run a campaign that Trump had been running for 4 years, for 8 years.
I want to show folks the Electoral College map of how Donald Trump won back all of the states that he had lost in 2020, 312 electoral votes to 226 for Kamala Harris. He also flipped the state of Nevada, which Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden both won. A big issue in that state was the housing crisis that you talked about there in a moment. But we're going to be talking about it all. We have a special hour-long edition of Talking Points tonight, which starts right now. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Talking Points. I'm Luke Radel.
And I'm Jake Morel. It's been less than a week since the election, and the transition process is already underway. President Biden has invited President-elect Trump to the White House for the customary meeting in the Oval Office.
And Jake, customary, even though 2020, President Trump refused to meet with Biden or attend his inauguration. So the last time this meeting happened, you're seeing it, 8 years ago after Trump won the 2016 race, a big surprise. He met with then-President Barack Obama in the Oval Office. The meeting between Trump and Biden, coming up this Wednesday, will be the first extended conversation between the two men since that debate back in June that we talked about a little earlier on CNN that ended President Biden's political career. Biden had this to say in the Rose Garden last week about the election outcome.
I know for some people, it's a time for victory, to state the obvious. For others, it's a time of loss. Campaigns are contests of competing visions. The country chooses one or the other. We accept the choice the country made. I've said many times, you can't love your country only when you win.
The White House has said that Biden will attend Trump's inauguration in January, and a moment that will make history for sure. So, who better to bring in for this discussion than some experts? Welcome to the show. Margaret Susan Thompson is an associate professor in the history department at the Maxwell School, teaching many classes, including on the modern American presidency. Pretty perfect for right now.
Indeed, and Rick Trunfio is an adjunct professor at the law school and a former assistant district attorney here in Onondaga County. He also served as an officer in the U.S. Navy JAG Corps, so on this Veterans Day and every day, we thank you for your service, sir. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here. Let's begin first with Professor Thompson. What is your reaction to the history that is made by
Well,
this
it
Trump
certainly was historic. We've only had one president serve two unconnected terms.
Yeah.
That was Grover Cleveland, another New Yorker. And so we're going to be facing that again.
Yeah, it should be really interesting to see how that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And what did you see in this election that surprised you results-wise?
Well, I think your opening remarks really captured a lot of it, that people didn't feel the economic success that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were trying to argue about during their campaign. They also felt dissatisfied. They felt forgotten. They felt, in many cases, overlooked by the Democrats, and that's something the Democratic Party is going to have to deal with over the next 2 years for the midterms and 4 years for the general.
They're also willing to overlook some of the former president's personal flaws, including the fact that he will be the first convicted felon ever sworn in as president. Professor Trunfio, do you expect we'll be seeing his sentencing or any of his other trials moving forward after this?
No, the Department of Justice has a policy that they don't prosecute presidents. Jack Smith's winding down the one prosecution he has left. Remember the national security one, the papers in Florida was dismissed. That appeal he'll withdraw that. Winding down the January 6th prosecution. The two remaining, there's three remaining. There's the Georgia one, which is on appeal.
Right.
We'll probably get a decision on that one relatively soon. The two in New York, one is the criminal conviction that you talked about. That is, the judge in that case is, he hasn't been sentenced yet, so it's not a conviction. I know everybody, it's a conviction. A conviction is not a conviction until the defendant's sentenced, because there's so many, a judge can set aside things before a sentence. In this particular case, the judge is now looking at a couple of issues. He's looking at the issue of immunity, and he's also looking at the issue of what was introduced at the trial.
Yeah.
What a lot of people, the same issues that overturned the Weinstein rape conviction are issues in the Trump case.
Yeah.
And then the civil matter that is also on appeal, I will tell you that the Attorney General's office did not get a very welcome response from the appellate division. They thought that civil fine was extraordinarily harsh.
Yeah.
They didn't think that there were some tough questions that the Attorney General's office had to ask. So I think that you'll probably see them all dissipate.
Well, just the practicality of trying to put a president of the United States in prison, or even having him pick up trash in the streets of Manhattan, like that doesn't seem practical.
And that's why the judge said that he was going to move the sentencing until after the election, because he wanted to make sure that he wasn't influencing the election. But I want to bring you back in here, Professor Thompson.
Yeah.
We've been watching Trump's cabinet picks come in. First for Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, his campaign co-chair, will become the first woman Chief of Staff, first female Chief of Staff, in White House history. What does that appointment mean for Trump's next term?
Well, that's very interesting. First of all, a Chief of Staff doesn't have to be approved by the Senate the way cabinet members do. So although they sit in the cabinet, they're not the same thing. And so all of those White House staffers can be appointed at the will of the president, dismissed at the will of the president. They don't have to be approved by anybody. Susie Wiles is an interesting choice. As you mentioned, she's the first woman. And that is, of course, historic. Just as in 2016, his campaign manager was the first woman to manage a successful presidential campaign. But here's the thing. She ran his campaign this time, obviously successfully. But it takes very different skills to win an election and then to govern. We don't know whether she's going to be able to make that transition. Most of her experience has either been in Congress, in the House of Representatives, or at the state level. She's had some experience, but she has no national governing experience, really. And she's going to be in the sit room a good bit of the time. We don't know what her foreign policy views are. She doesn't have experience, so it's going to be very interesting. Also, Donald Trump picked as his deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, who I think is a controversial choice because he's so doctrinaire and he's so outspoken. As far as I know, he has little to no administrative skill, and that's really an administrative job. So it's going to be interesting to see how a self-described moderate Republican, that's how Susie Wiles described herself as recently as 2024, and somebody like Stephen Miller, who views himself as a real America First MAGA ideologue, are going to get along.
And a hardliner immigration, which we will be talking about a little later on in the program. Another high priority for Donald Trump is picking an attorney general. He wasn't so happy with Bill Barr or Jeff Sessions the last time around. What are you watching for in some of his next picks? I think we have an example of some of the list of names that he's looking for this time, like a Mike Lee out of Utah, Ken Paxton from Texas. What are you keeping an eye on?
I think Ken Paxton's a long shot. I think that I think of the front runners, John Ratcliffe, who's the former DNI in his administration. Matt Whitaker, he is a career justice guy. Mike Lee is a possibility. Schmidt dropped out today. Schmidt said he didn't want it. So
Missouri, Right.
So
one of the other options is Judge Eileen Cannon out of Florida, who, as you talked about, dismissed those documents case. Do you think that's a potential?
No, I don't think that's going to happen. No.
Just a little bit of wish casting, maybe.
I think that nobody really knows. I think that it's like when he was picking his vice president. Nobody really knows, and I think that. I actually don't know where Ken Paxton's name came from. I think that would be a disaster.
Yeah, it's possible that Cannon, maybe if not as AG, could end up on the Supreme Court, Jay.
Which is what I wanted to get into next. For both of you, obviously, Trump's last term in office, he appointed so many Supreme Court justices that then overturned Roe v. Wade, a few other controversial decisions. What does his second presidency look like with the Supreme Court to both of you? We'll start with you, Professor Thompson.
Well, I don't think Judge Cannon is a likely choice for the Supreme Court. I might see her on a district court. U.S. District Court. But I don't think she's ready for the Supreme Court. And I think there are a lot more qualified people who would fit Donald Trump's ideological criteria.
Everybody's assuming that somebody's going to leave the Supreme Court, right?
Thomas said he's not leaving until he's 101.
Yeah, he's going to be the longest serving justice. He's just got to make it to 2028.
Sotomayor said CNN today that she doesn't plan on leaving. I know that progressives have been trying to nudge her out. She's not going anywhere. She's 70. The oldest judge on the Supreme Court is Thomas. He's 76. Alito, 74. And the next oldest judge is Roberts, and he's 69. So unless somebody dies or somebody retires, the Supreme Court composition isn't going to change.
Yeah, and quickly before we go, Professor Thompson, a lot of your fellow Democrats have been calling on Sonia Sotomayor to resign before the end of Biden's term. Are you one of those?
It's not going to happen. It's
Do you
not
think
going to
she's-
happen.
I don't think it's going to happen, but do you think it should happen?
No, I don't.
I agree with you,
I
Margaret.
think her health is not terrific, but there's no sign that her health won't allow her to serve for 4 more years. Interestingly, you pointed to the fact that he might not get any Supreme Court nominees or appointees.
Yes.
The last president who fits that category is Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter is now 100 years old himself.
Maybe they'll appoint him to the Supreme Court.
I
We'll have to
think
see what happens,
he's
Professor
not a
Thompson.
lawyer. It's not a lawyer.
We'll see. We'll see what
You
happens.
know, one of the things I want to say is, everybody was pushing. I mean, everybody, the Democratic Party was pushing to eliminate the filibuster and to pack the court. I'm pretty sure we're not going to hear that in the next 4 years.
Not anymore.
And you know, in your opening remarks, you talked about democracy worked. Well, that's what happens, right? When everybody that's in power thinks they're going to be in power forever. Sure. And I'm pretty sure that the Democratic Party now is never going to mention, at least in the next 4 years, packing the court or eliminating the filibuster. And they can really thank 2 centrists on the Democratic side, Sinema and Manchin, for that not being present right now.
Professor Thompson, Professor Trumpfield, thank you both so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Really appreciate it, guys. Well, Donald Trump made big gains across multiple voter groups this election, but one of them the most prominent, young men. What is causing the shift after the break? Stay with us.
Look at you. You're at the top of your game. You're unstoppable. Nothing can throw you off track. Wait, is that your car? Uh-oh. Yeah, I saw that coming. That will throw you off track. You're looking at around 10 grand in fines, legal fees, and increased insurance rates. Let's try this again. Smart move. Because buzz driving is drunk driving.
I don't remember how it started.
Go to that.
Our back and forth. It always came back.
Dad!
You probably don't remember what you told me,
That was perfect.
but I heard every word.
They told me a bottle couldn't dream. That I would never become a superhero. But I learned how to fly. Just to come back in a new disguise. And be the hero that I've always wanted to be.
Welcome back into Talking Points. Through TikTok posts, memes, and podcasts, former President Donald Trump's campaign introduced Make America Great Again to younger voters, and they showed up for him.
According to exit polls, young men between the ages of 18 and 29 swung enormously for Trump, shifting right by 8 percentage points since 2020. Joining us now to discuss is Mike LaMorte, co-anchor on Market Shares, love that show, and an election special analyst. Good to see you again. Welcome back to the show.
And Ilana Epstein is also here, a co-host of Juice and Java and Unpeeled. She was also a senior media analyst for our election special. Thank you both so much for being here. Ilana, start with you since you're our resident TikTok expert. How is TikTok reacting?
Oh my gosh, well, I think anyone couldn't go anywhere on social media without seeing people's reactions. I mean, people were posting night of, the next day. Some people even took a few days to post their reactions, but there definitely were a lot of mixed reactions. Let's take a look.
This can't be real. Yo, I'm scared to go to sleep. I might wake up a mother slave.
J. Trump will be the 47th president of the United States.
So we see that reaction there on social media.
All across the spectrum.
All across the spectrum. But we mentioned earlier how young people, at least young men, swung really, really hard for Trump. And we've talked so much about this show, about the MAGAverse and the MAGA bros.
The manosphere.
Right, the manosphere. What did you see in the Trump campaign that swung young men so hard for him in this election?
Well, yeah. Well, first off, I just really want to pinpoint the data there, Jake. You guys talked about some data there before, but to bring in some data from the national election poll. In 2020, we saw 56% of young men supporting Biden. That was a 15-point margin that literally swung in favor of Donald Trump in 2020. So why exactly did that happen? I think there was a lot of boots on the ground work, especially at college campuses where there's always a lot of young voters. I even went over to Penn State a couple of weeks ago where I saw Vivek Ramaswamy. He was out there with Charlie Kirk. They spoke a lot to those college students. They even were trying to pull some young voters to vote in places like State College. And he was even successful, Charlie Kirk, in doing so, if you want to take a look.
I want to try to win you over as a liberal for Donald Trump. So you're going to give me a chance, okay?
I will, sir.
All right, okay. What's happening at the Democrat Party is this very sinister combination. It's a party of censorship, it's a party of war, a party of open borders that is against actual traditional liberal values.
I agree.
So which way you leaning?
Can I get a hat?
That's a good answer.
And Mike, it's really interesting to see those conservatives going into potentially, combative spaces like college campuses, traditionally seen as liberal, to try and win over folks, particularly those young men voters. And for you, Ilana, talking about Harris's media strategy, she decided not to do the Joe Rogan Experience podcast that Donald Trump did in the closing days of the campaign. How did that hurt her reach when talking to those particularly young men voters?
Yeah, Luke, I think a lot of people assumed Gen Z was Democrat, so this did come as a surprise. And a lot of young voters, both male and female, care about the economy. And Harris's campaign really did focus on abortion. And I do want to talk about these podcasts. Trump was on Theo Von, Joe Rogan, Logan Paul, Aiden Ross, the Aiden Ross stream, which I think a lot of people thought was a joke, but in reality, this is what a lot of those apolitical voters are watching. And Trump did win over a lot of votes in that way. The Call Her Daddy podcast that Kamala Harris was on got 849,000 views. That's just talking about YouTube. The Joe Rogan video on YouTube currently has 48 million. So 48 million versus 849,000, that's really showing a huge gap there. And also with these celebrity endorsements, I think a lot of people thought this was gonna help, but a lot of people want to hear from local working class people, not these celebrities who are living completely different lifestyles. So I think a lot of people are saying that the Harris campaign really did miss out by not going on these other podcasts that Trump did.
Yeah, Ilana, so interesting about the appearances that Trump did on non-traditional media. And when you're watching his acceptance speech, Aiden Ross was mentioned in a presidential inspection.
He called up Dana White.
I know, and Aiden, he mentioned Aiden Ross, something I thought I would never see in a presidential acceptance speech, but it looked like it worked with young men. But I also want to talk about young women and their swing in this election.
Yeah, so going back to that national election poll data, 65% of women, young women rather, supported Joe Biden back in 2020. Now that was a 33% margin in favor of the Democrats. But then you go 4 years in the future over to 2020, 58% of young women supported Kamala. That's 14 points shifted over
drop
to the
even post-Dobbs.
Exactly. Now,
which is the opposite of what we've been hearing.
Female candidate.
Right.
So what is that showing? Well, that's showing that the Kamala Harris campaign focused so much on things like abortion, things like women's health rights and access to it thereof. But that wasn't enough, that there were so much other policies that even women, young women, were taking into account, such as immigration, such as the economy. And apparently, to young voters, even those policies might matter more, especially in the long term. We saw Kamala Harris go on The View a couple of months ago, and when she was asked, would she have done anything differently than Joe Biden did in those administrations, her response was, well, I've been in the room making these decisions with him, counseling him. I wouldn't change much. That, therefore, translates to the young voters. That lets them know, well, there are issues that are going on in the country right now with the economy, with immigration, and those matter as well. And if you're not going to change anything about that, well, the data shows that they're very opinionated on it.
And I think so often young voters are looking for change candidates. I feel like that's just kind of a very young person thing to be looking for someone who's bringing change. And both candidates offered their own definition of what change would be, and clearly they went with Donald Trump's definition, at least the majority of the country did, even though the majority of young voters actually did support Harris. But I want to bring you in, Ilana, because we're looking at this gender gap of women supporting Harris by 24 points, men supporting by 2 points. Bit of a gulf there between the two. I've been talking to a lot of friends of mine who are either in relationships or have friends that voted for Donald Trump. What is the sentiment here?
There's a lot going around on social media of people saying that politics is going to affect the relationships. A lot of Trump supporters are posting about not letting politics get in the way, and a lot of Harris voters are posting about saying how could it not get in the way. I want to point out a graphic from Matt Burstein. He is a queer makeup artist, and he's amassed about 2 million followers by posting about his social and political views. He said, quote, "Why is it always the people who have just voted away someone else's human rights who are saying this?" And a lot of people are saying that what friends and families are posting that it matters, and that groups of people should have, that if we differ in what people believe if we differ in political views, that could actually alter your view of someone. And I think this is very interesting because politics, people on social media are sharing their views of politics, and that's never really been the case before.
And it's hard to see how, if you block those people out, how you're going to convince them to vote for your side the next time around.
Yeah, and that's something we'll talk about later in the show, but so interesting. Ilana, Epstein, Mike LaMorte, thank you so much for joining us.
Guys, coming up, tariffs, mass deportations, and tax cuts are all a part of President-elect Trump's economic plan. What voters can actually expect to see in 90 seconds.
Hi, my name is Sadie Miller.
My name is Luke Brady. I go by St. Luke.
So this one I started with this guitar lick.
Most party fouls are pretty dumb. But if you decide to drink and drive underage, you could lose your license and your freedom. Underage drinking and driving. The ultimate party foul.
Welcome back into Talking Points. Let's take a look at what Stephen Miller had to say at Madison Square Garden last week.
Who's going to stand up for our daughters? Who's going to stand up for the girls of America, the women of America, the families of America? Who's going to stand up and say the cartels are gone, the criminal migrants are gone, the gangs are gone, America is for Americans and Americans only?
That was Stephen Miller, a top immigration advisor to the president-elect. Sources tell CNN's Elena Treen that Miller will return to the White House, this time as Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. We discussed that with our professor panel earlier. Some pretty inflammatory rhetoric.
Yeah, Miller previously worked as Trump's lead speechwriter and has pushed for mass deportations of illegal immigrants. Joining us now to unpack Trump and Miller's expansive immigration plans is Talking Points analyst Peter Berry. Hey, Peter.
Hey, Luke and Jake, how's it going? So immigration and its policy was a centerpiece in the Trump campaign for his presidential campaign in 2024. But even when he wins, he's still talking about sealing the border. Take a listen to one of his victory speeches after he won the presidential election.
We're going to have to seal up those borders, and we're going to have to let people come into our country. We want people to come back in, but we have to let them come back in, but they have to come in legally. They have to come in legally.
According to Pew, there's around 47.5 million immigrants living in the U.S., and around 11 million of them are living here illegally. But he's called on some people, such as former ICE Director Tom Homan and now Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, to handle the mass deportations. But he's also circling around some main issues such as jobs, that 8.3 million immigrants, undocumented immigrants, are taking the American jobs. Take a listen to one of his rallies.
Just they're taking your jobs. They're taking your jobs. Every job produced in this country over the last 2 years has gone to illegal aliens. Every job. Think of it. What we're doing to this country is so sad.
Well, maybe not every job has been taken, but two of the main businesses that will be affected are construction and agriculture. According to CNBC, 14% of the construction workers in America are undocumented. And according to the Department of Agriculture, 41% of farm workers are undocumented workers. But let's take a look at some of the policies here. He's going to talk about going back to 2016, building the wall and renewing the Muslim ban, trying to stem the mass flow in immigration. He's also having remain in Mexico. Immigrants are having their case heard and they're going to stay in Mexico. But Trump doesn't really care about the price tag for taxpayers. But how much are they going to foot the bill? Well, Tom Homan, now the Trump borders are, had a CBS News interview on 60 Minutes. Let's take a listen to what he said about the budget.
It would cost $88 billion to deport 1 million people a year.
I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Is that what American taxpayers should expect?
What price do you put on national security? Is that worth it?
Is there a way to carry out mass deportation without separating families?
Of course there is.
According to CBS News, it would cost around $20,000 to deport each and every migrant. But Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, also talked about putting soldiers on the southern border. Here's what he said at CPAC in February.
Deputize the National Guard to carry out immigration enforcement, and then you also deploy the military to the southern border, not just with a mission to observe, but with an impedance and denial mission. In other words, you reassert the fundamental constitutional principle that you don't have a right to enter into our sovereign territory, to even request the asylum claim. The military has the right to establish a fortress position on the border and to say no one can cross here at all.
A lot of the illegal immigrants are living in democratic states, so it's going to be a court battle for the federal government to fight the states' governments as Trump tries to push his agenda here. Luke and Jake, I'm going to send it back to you guys.
Peter, thanks so much. The proposal there from the potential White House Deputy Chief of Staff is to use troops on kids and families seeking asylum in the United States.
Something that you can expect to be a tough court battle, and also something that he mentioned that might put strain on the economy. Absolutely. With historically low unemployment. If they're losing laborers who are undocumented immigrants, there might be a strain on that. That might affect wages of Americans who were born right here in the United States. But let's keep it with talking about the cabinet, and I want to talk about a potential cabinet pick that's drawn a lot of attention recently. We're going to bring in Riley Underwood and Alex Burstein. Alex, what do you got on the FDA?
Yeah, well, we don't really know where RFK Jr. is going to be in this administration, but it's looking like he's going to be something with public health. There's been ideas floated for him to be a health czar in the White House, maybe lead the FDA or the Health and Human Services. But it's been a big separation from what we originally saw of Trump back in May at the NRA conference. He was saying that he thinks that RFK is the most far-left candidate in this race for Democrats, and now that's been a major change. Now he's offering him a spot in the administration. A lot of question marks about some of RFK's policies and how they actually relate to science, but there's been a lot of question marks. We'll see where he actually ends up in this administration.
Noted anti-vaxxer, someone who wants to take the fluoride out of the water, now being put in charge of healthcare policy, according to Trump. Go wild on public health.
And somebody who, when he had influence over using vaccines or not using them, pushed Samoa, a small island nation, to not use vaccines that could have contributed to that measles outbreak that was there. Something that's pretty interesting to see if he has any control over public health in a country of 350 million people. But speaking of those 350 million people, we're going to talk about the economy. That's why I'm bringing in Riley Underwood. What do Trump's economic policies look like for the next 4 years?
Well, it's something, Jake, that he's really been hammering down on during this whole campaign trail. And it started with his past work in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was almost the most sweeping tax overhaul they've had in decades. And the thing is, guys, he's going to put in more tax cuts. That's his big thing. People care about the economy. That was one of their top issues, and that's what he's been promising them. He wants to lower those interest rates, create more jobs, lower those gas and grocery prices, and make housing more affordable. And the way he thinks he's going to do that is tariffs on imported goods. He's huge on tariffs in this campaign cycle. He pledged to slap 60% tariffs on all goods coming in from China and 10% tariffs on goods imported from all other countries. He also said he's going to put a 200% tariff on all cars getting imported from Mexico. And you may be thinking, oh, we don't have many Mexican cars in our country, but that's not true. A lot of them are actually manufactured in Mexico, and it's going to stop construction on a $10 billion project that Elon Musk is putting in with Tesla on a new plant. And his response to his economic policy, it was a big reason he was elected.
Yeah, one of the ways in which Trump wants to stimulate the economy is by loosening up environmental regulations. And we actually learned earlier today, just a few short hours ago, who he was appointing to head up the EPA. Lee Zeldin is his pick, the former congressman from New York and the former gubernatorial candidate here in New York. Got close to winning statewide in a very blue state, did not end up doing it. I want to show you what Lee Zeldin had to say a little earlier on today. He's going to be nominated to the role of EPA administrator. And he says, quote, "We will restore U.S. energy dominance, revitalize our auto industry, as you mentioned, and bring back American jobs, and make the U.S. the global leader of AI while protecting access to clean air and water." Important to note, Jake, that U.S. oil production has hit record highs under the Biden-Harris administration, another accomplishment of theirs. But Alex, these environmental issues were one thing that Trump said he'd be keeping RFK Jr. far away from, right?
Yeah, so RFK Jr., a former environmental lawyer who had some differing thoughts on the environment.
Is he a doctor, or why would he be in charge of health? Not a doctor?
There's a lot of questions about where he's going to end up, but during his speech on Tuesday night, he was talking about they're going to give RFK a lot of free reign over stuff like vaccines, like health, but they're not going to let him anywhere near gas, anywhere near oil. They're going to leave that to other people.
The liquid gold.
The liquid gold.
Yeah, very interesting. We talk about that, and we talk about Lee Zeldin saying they want to make the U.S. the world leader in AI, of course, something that you need computer chips for, Luke, right? And we talked about the CHIPS Act right here in central New York, so much Micron building right in our backyard in Clay, something that Luke kind of caused a controversy about a few weeks ago with Speaker Johnson, who at first said they were going to repeal it, then said they were going to reform it. Trump said that he wasn't a big fan of the CHIPS Act on that Joe Rogan podcast. Thanks, Ilana, for notifying me of that a few weeks ago.
Of course, and he said that he wanted to put tariffs on chip manufacturers to get them to come back. What do economists say, Riley, about the effectiveness of tariffs in boosting the U.S. economy?
Well, right now it seems like they're all in because the market is soaring, the stock market. And if we can pull up a quote from Jake Colvin, he's the National Foreign Trade Council, he's the president of that, and he's saying it's going to be interesting to see how we're going to see the response to this. He said companies are either going to have to develop a tariff strategy and they're going to have to decide whether they'll absorb that cost, pass it on to the consumers, or remove the Chinese content as a whole from their goods. So it's really going to be interesting to see how they actually do respond to this, because these 60% taxes basically is really going to put a strain on the importer and the person that's getting the goods.
Yeah, absolutely. And the price of goods as well. And we talked so much about those economic statistics at the beginning of the show. The stock market has hit record highs over the past 2 years under the Biden administration, something that me and you talked about that maybe they didn't communicate to the American people as well. But it'll be interesting to see how that is affected. And one other thing that I want to talk about is Trump is usually a very volatile guy. He could wake up and say that we're going to leave NATO. He could wake up and make a really big foreign policy decision that could affect supply chain in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe. And it'll be interesting to see how the markets react to that, and if that corporate tax break that some of those companies are going to get is going to do anything for them, considering that the stock market might sort of freak out if he does something that roils global markets, and they might have to foot those tariffs. So 100%. Very, very interesting things to watch.
And Jake, some companies are as large as countries now, Apple and Amazon.
That's true.
I mean,
that's a very good point. Very good point. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Alex. Riley.
Thanks, guys.
The fight over House control is still up in the air with less than 20 races left to be called. We'll break down the path to Republican control of Washington after the break. Stay with us.
You quit smoking and thought, that's that. But here's the thing about lung cancer. By the time you see the symptoms, it could be too late. detect lung cancer early when it's more curable. If you smoked, get scanned. Talk to your doctor or learn more at savedbythescan.org.
Come on, it's not that hard.
My big man fingers are having a problem with these little tiny buttons.
Whoa, watch it there. Your blood pressure's gonna go through the roof.
Tell me about it. I'm trying to learn how to get it down. Instead, it keeps going up.
High blood pressure can increase the risk for heart attack or stroke. Learn how to keep yours at a healthy range.
Ever hear a voice command? Just say text barbershop to 97779.
That's not what I said.
Just give me that. Now my blood pressure's up.
Welcome back into Talking Points. Jake Morel alongside Luke Radel.
Just here for the ride.
Just here for the ride.
Rocking and rolling.
The election of Donald Trump has not only made headlines in the States, but across the globe as well. And here to break down the reactions of world leaders and what a Trump presidency could mean for their country's agenda is Talking Points analyst Harrison Calder. Harrison?
Jake, how's it going? The world this coming January could look very different under a Trump presidency, and that is very apparent to many of the world's leaders. One of them, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was thrilled at the results. He wrote on X, formerly Twitter, "Dear Donald and Melania Trump, congratulations on history's greatest comeback. Your historic return to the White House offers a new beginning for America and a powerful recommitment to the alliance between Israel and America. This is a huge victory." He then signed his and his wife's names. Israel has been involved in a war with Hamas, a political organization that governs the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu believes that his ally in America has needed to help more and that Trump will do so. Another major global conflict is between Russia and American ally Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took to X following the election results to say, "I appreciate President Trump's commitment to the peace through strength approach in global affairs. This is exactly the principle that can practically bring just peace in Ukraine closer. I am hopeful that we can put it together into action." The United States has been the largest security backer of Ukraine, and Zelensky needs the continued support from the U.S. President Vladimir Putin of Russia, who is on the other side of this conflict with Ukraine, praised Trump. He said his actions during the assassination attempt on his life back in July made him a brave man. Xi Jinping, the president of China, also congratulated the former president, saying he hopes the powerful nations can respect each other and coexist peacefully. Another leader new in their power is Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom. Though expecting to differ in policies with Trump, he said on X, "From defense and security to growth and prosperity, the relationship between the UK and US is incredibly strong and will continue to thrive for many years to come." The re-election of former President Donald Trump is expected to have a complete change on American foreign affairs within conflict as well as diplomacy around the world. It will be interesting to see what these leaders decide to do before Trump takes office. That's all I have. Luke, back to you.
Harrison, thank you. And to answer your question, man, I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
We're hanging in. Hour-long show. Jake, one of these two people on the screen behind me is set to be the next U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
Congratulations, Luke.
Thank you.
Wow.
Appreciate it. Put it on the LinkedIn.
That is incredible.
100%. No, it's actually House GOP Conference Chair Elise Stefanik from New York's 21st Congressional District, just north of us, up in the North Country. Stefanik, Jake, has been a strong ally of Israel and garnered national attention for those House committee hearings she held last year with leaders from college campuses on anti-Semitism that led to the resignations at Harvard and UPenn last year.
Okay, a little disappointed to see that you will not be the UN ambassador, but Stefanik's departure means the GOP loses one seat in the House until a special election is held. That margin for the majority is set to be razor thin, and we don't even know who's going to be in charge of the House when it reconvenes next year. There are still several toss-up races yet to be called. And to take a look at those, our Drew Matyasik is at the magic map for us tonight. Hey, Drew.
Thanks, guys. It's been around a week since the election happened, and we still have no idea who's going to have control of the House. Right now, 214 for the Republicans, 205 for the Democrats. Remember, Democrats needed 4 net gain seats to flip control of the House. Looks like it's going to be a big long shot for them as they've only flipped 5. But Republicans have a net gain of 2 right now. So we're going to start up here in the Northwest. This is a key seat which isn't really going to have any effect on who controls the House of Representatives, but it's important to note Dan Newhouse, a Republican that Donald Trump has been going after ever since he voted to impeach him in 2020, is in a razor-thin battle right now for Washington's 4th congressional district. No national news sources have called it. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not the Pacific Northwest is going to go to that side of the Republican Party for Donald Trump. Now, when we go a little bit south to California, we go to the 27th district here for a little bit. Mike Garcia, who won re-election in 2020, 2022 by razor-thin margins. You go back to 2020's numbers when he represented the 25th congressional district. It was a 50-50 race. Just a few hundred votes separated him and Christy Smith. He ended up coming out on top. Right now, looks like he is in the battle for his political career, losing right now to George Whiteside. That race should be called for the Democrats very, very soon. Now we go down to Arizona. I really want to go into this race right here in Arizona's 6th congressional district, where it looks like Kirsten Engel's going to she's in a position right now, she's looking like she could potentially flip this, as when we look at how many votes are in, only 86% of the votes are in. And Arizona did really well for Ruben Gallego, didn't do so well for Kamala Harris. And one last one when we go over here to Iowa's 1st congressional district, Marionette Miller Meeks, who is held on by the thinnest of margins in her political career. Also in another battle, 50.1% of the vote, 99% of the votes in. Looks like this one's going to go to a recount.
6 votes in 2020 was the margin of victory for Miller Meeks there, Drew.
Yeah, pretty close. Pretty close. You know what? Let's keep it in the Midwest. Let's keep it in Iowa's 1st congressional district. There's been a lot of recent electoral history there. Can you explain to us how close this seat has been?
Yeah, Jake, now let's go back to 2020, and then let's go and see the final number right there. 6 votes, 196,958 for Rita Hart. 6 more votes Marionette Miller Meeks got. It was so close that Rita Hart had to petition, and it went through the courts for months and months. Marionette Miller Meeks was provisionally seated as a representative in 2021, and it took months before that petition was finally dropped by Hart, and she could finally take her seat in the United States House of Representatives. 2022, it was a bigger margin for her. She won by a good amount, but now it's getting a little tighter.
Drew, can we head up to Maine for a second? We all know that every 2 years, Jared Golden is a prime target for Republicans. Is he going to hold on again this year?
Yeah, it was a tough race for him this year. Donald Trump won Maine's 2nd congressional district. Right now, it looks like he's just a few thousand votes separate them. Some sources have called it for Jared Golden, but right now, it looks like it could go to a recount. You go back a few years, Republicans haven't done as well as the polls say they should. Right now, it's also looking like they underperformed in the 2nd congressional district again this year for the House race.
Drew Matyasik, we love the magic map. Thank you so much.
Next time, take the jacket off, and maybe we could go full Kornacki. I feel like that would be. I feel like that would be a lot of fun. Let's move now to another Trump cabinet pick announcement. I'm sorry. We're not going to go to another cabinet pick announcement because we're going to go to break. Coming up for us, we're going to talk about the places where Democrats did well on Tuesday night. It's a limited list. I'll show you right after this.
Welcome back into Talking Points. While Republicans had a victorious Tuesday night, Democrats had some wins down the ballot. Swing states including Arizona and Michigan voted for Trump despite having Democratic Senate seat wins. We bring in Talking Points analysts Ben Bascuk and Isabella Galan to explain exactly what happened here.
Bella, welcome back from our election special. We're so happy to have new faces on Talking Points. We're going to start with an old face over here, Ben, because
how are we doing?
You were covering the Michigan Senate race on election night.
Closely.
And it's really interesting. We've been talking before about Liz Cheney, and you don't think she's a very effective surrogate.
Beating a dead horse here, Luke.
100%. But Guess who was campaigning very closely?
Who was it, Luke? Who was it?
It was Alyssa Slotkin. Can we show the photos? She's literally hugging Liz Cheney. She was the first Democrat that Liz Cheney ever endorsed way back in 2022. Slotkin managed to come out on top. So why did Slotkin win and Harris didn't? It definitely wasn't Liz Cheney because they were both all out there.
Yeah, Luke, something we need to make very clear here is Alyssa Slotkin is not Kamala Harris. And this endorsement means a lot different between the two candidates.
Fact check that.
So, I mean, when we look at Liz Cheney's endorsement for Kamala Harris's versus Alyssa Slotkin, those candidates are completely different. And I think this whole race comes down to, when we're looking down ballot at these Senate races, at those blue wins in red states, is it was a race for the Oval as much as it was a race away from Joe Biden. And Kamala Harris was unable to differentiate herself from the Biden administration. Alyssa Slotkin, on the other hand, was able to stand on her own 2 feet, away from the DNC, away from the establishment, away from those legacy Democrats, and campaign for things that Michiganders care about. Campaign for a commitment to American manufacturing, America First policies, going away from EVs, still kind of supporting them, but standing on her own 2 feet and differentiating her campaign from these legacy Democrats, from the establishment. That's what the key to these Senate races. That's the key to these blue seats. I mean, we look at Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Joe Biden has a 55% disapproval rating. I mean, the majority of Americans do not approve of the sitting president, and they associate Kamala Harris with that sitting president. This was a referendum on the DNC, a referendum on Joe Biden. For Alyssa Slotkin, she was able to differentiate herself. We saw a poll from UW-Madison that estimated 1 out of 10 voters voted split ticket. I mean, those margins were so slim in these states. 0.3% in Michigan that won Slotkin the race. It's those 1 out of 10 voters who voted split ticket.
Absolutely, Ben. That's really, really tight, and we want to talk about that in Arizona as well.
Yes.
And of course, important to note the messaging on those things: manufacturing, unions, CHIPS Act, all those things that the Biden administration did but failed to message on, and that allowed some other Senate candidates to distance themselves and win in Arizona.
Yeah, for sure. Gallego did exactly that. Just like Ben mentioned before, it's really just trying to separate themselves. The candidates that did well, that were part of the Democratic Party, the candidates that did well separated themselves from Joe Biden and focused on issues that the voters cared about in that state. So for Arizona, they were focusing on the border, and Gallego didn't shy away from that. He continued to show that he knew that they needed to emphasize to secure that southern border, and that's exactly what he did. And he also just wanted to make sure that he was relating directly to the Arizona people. He mentioned his story about leaning on his up by the bootstraps personal story, how he's in the Marine Corps, how he grew up Hispanic. A lot of the demographic of the voters in Arizona are Hispanic voters, and he really just wanted to connect with them on a personal level instead of just following on the, I don't know if you want to say like the bandwagon of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, absolutely. And one interesting thing that I was watching in that Arizona Senate race is that Carrie Lake, who lost the governor's race a few years ago, still has not seated it, by the way, went out in another statewide race and lost again. And if we could pull up this meme really quick, I think it perfectly describes Arizona politics. There it is, get in loser, we're going losing. Carrie Lake.
Who's it from? Yeah. Who's the meme from? From Meghan McCain, the daughter of John McCain, the late John McCain, legend in Arizona. But it wasn't just Arizona and Michigan.
Right.
We were also looking at Wisconsin. Tammy Baldwin won re-election there, and Jackie Rosen won re-election in Nevada. Starting with you, Ben, how did Baldwin pull that off? Was it similar to Slotkin?
It's the same thing as Slotkin. She's speaking to those concerns in an honest way, away from the DNC that her constituents care about. In Wisconsin, that was farmers and rural residents. She spoke a lot about agriculture. She appealed to those appeals. With Slotkin in Michigan, it was auto manufacturing. There has to be a way that Democrats in this current day and age can step away from this crumbly and DNC foundation and stand on their own 2 feet. And that's their key to winning these races. Very few races that they did win when it came to the Senate, but the ones that they did, that's the same trend we see down ballot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to stick with that because Rosen, who kept her seat, did not attend the DNC.
No, she didn't. And that, I think, was a smart move on her part because she then instead focused her campaign on working across the aisle with other Republican, not only just Republican candidates, but then also appealing to those Republican voters. And she did have a bit of an advantage when it came to campaigning and the funding that she did have. She did have significant, sizable cash advantage over Brown, who she was campaigning against. But I really think by taking that step away, still, she was endorsed by Kamala Harris, and she recognized that, but she didn't necessarily make that the only thing. And she was able to then really maintain her spot and make sure that voters knew that what she was talking about was important.
Well, it wasn't just those Senate candidates. We also saw a lot of House Democrats across New York State do well. John Mannion here in the 22nd District. Pat Ryan from the Hudson Valley, who won his seat 2 years ago by just a point, this time winning by 13. He posted this long thread on X saying, quote, "First and foremost, if you're using the words moderate or progressive, you're missing the whole effing point. It's not ideological. It's about who fights for people versus who enables the elites." You're talking, Ben, about those elites. The DNC is perceived as being an elitist group.
Yeah, I mean, we look at Pat Ryan specifically, right? And he spoke out. He said it's not about identity politics and labels. He stood on his own 2 feet. He campaigned with AOC when it came to climate change, but he campaigned against Joe Biden when it came to the border. I mean, these candidates have to do this in an honest way where they stick to their principles. That's going to be the key for the Democratic Party. That's going to be the reformation going forward.
Ben and Bella, thank you very much. We really appreciate having you.
Well, in just 74 days, Vice President Kamala Harris will leave office with no plans yet of how her political career will proceed.
Yeah, despite her defeat, Jake, Harris was the first female vice president and the first female presidential candidate of color. To talk more about Harris's legacy, we bring in Talking Points analyst Andrea-Rose Oates to figure out how exactly historic this run really was. Hey, Andy.
Hey, Luke. Vice President Kamala Harris's 2024 presidential campaign has officially come to an end, following major challenges in key battleground states, a narrowing path to victory, and a notable shortfall in support from rural voters. Even though the outcome resulted in a loss, this does mark a unique moment in United States political history, as Vice President Harris was not only the first woman of color to serve as vice president, but also the first person to run for president from that position. Her campaign, rooted in the belief that we are not going back, but rather pushing forward, while ultimately unsuccessful, brought a lot of national visibility to the issues of racial and gender inequality, as well as her impact, which continues to reverberate in political strategies, minority representation, and female representation in all spaces, especially in the highest offices in the land. The question of what's next for Harris still remains, but trust that whatever she pursues, she will continue to fight for the American dream.
Much. Will be interesting to see if she ends up running for governor of California, perhaps, or once again in 4 years. We're not going to say the name, I promise. We're not going to say the name of the year. There's no election coming up. We're all done with elections.
Yeah,
now, right,
well,
Jake?
we'll have to keep a close eye on that. But coming up, one last thing from us on this Veterans Day. Stay with us.
They call me Maxie, but I prefer tripod. I was your above-average four-legged homie, and then wham, bam, minivan. Some people pity me. Now that's lame. I still run, fetch, and swim. And the ladies love me. I'm the ultimate wingman. Just don't ask me to high five.
Welcome back into Talking Points. We're going to wrap up on this very special Veterans Day 1-hour show by thanking some of the veterans that have impacted our lives. I'm going to go first, Jake, and show you. This is my grandpa, Don Snyder. He was in the Army. He was a communications officer. He worked at Fort Knox. And so I like to think him being a communications officer kind of fueled me into running for communications school. I love him very much. He was very involved in politics. Actually drove me to my first interview as a journalist when I was 14 years old. So I love you, Grandpa. He passed away 3 years ago now, but we thank him for his service.
Very sweet, Luke. Well, I've got a few veterans in my family. The first one I want to say, not up on the board here, but my great-grandfather, Buck Morel, who fought in the Pacific in World War II. And then my grandfather on my mom's side, Pat Hogan, who was in the Navy. And then, of course, probably the biggest influence in my life, my role model, somebody who I spent my entire life with until he went off to the United States Coast Guard Academy, Coast Guard officer Brian Morel. So just want to give a big shout out to him and a few of his friends as well, who I'm very close with. Javier Alvarez, Frank Linzo, Dave McCullough, and so many of those other Coast Guard guys that have been so nice to me and who I have sort of grown up watching them grow into these officers and these public servants, and I just want to thank them for their service.
And one of the great things about these folks, we talk a lot about elections here, and no matter who's in power, who's the commander-in-chief, these folks serve. They put their lives on the line for this country. They believe in democracy. They believe in our process, and they're the ones that protect it. They let us have freedom of speech. They let us have free elections. Not every country in the world has a system as great as ours, Jake.
No, absolutely not, Luke, and so much that we can learn from them. As I mentioned, so much that I learned from my grandpa and my brother growing up, not only about civics education, but just about being a good person and being willing to serve others. And I think that's something that's really, really important to keep in mind as all of the political stuff flies around us, that it's about serving your country and it's about serving others. And that's something that we should really, really think about.
There's some great people. It's a great country. We thank Pat, we thank Brian, we thank Don for their service. We thank Professor Rick Trunfio for his service and for coming in. Professor Margaret Susan Thompson, thank you so much for coming in. That is all the time we have for you on this week's episode of Talking Points, Jake.
Yep, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at CitrusTV News and like us on Facebook. I'm Jake Morel.
And I'm Luke Radel. You guys have a great week, Syracuse, and go thank a veteran.